The sound of gravel crunching under his car tires gave Adrian a small sense of satisfaction as he pulled into the driveway. He smiled to himself, imagining Camila's face when she saw him. His business trip had ended early, and he had decided to surprise her by coming home a day ahead of schedule. He glanced at the bouquet of white lilies on the passenger seat, Camila's favorite flowers. He had even stopped by her favorite bakery to grab the chocolate croissant she adored. It wasn't their anniversary, but he felt like celebrating anyway. Sliding out of the car, he grabbed his briefcase and the flowers. There's a delivery truck parked. The house looked the same, calm, serene, and welcoming. Nothing seemed out of place. He paused at the front door, fumbling for his keys, when a strange noise reached his ears. It was faint, almost lost in the background of chirping birds, but it was there, a rhythmic creaking sound, followed by muffled voices. Adrian tilted his head, his brows furrowing. At first, he thought it might be the TV. Camila sometimes watched those reality shows with overly dramatic arguments, but this didn't sound like that. He stepped closer to the side of the house where the bedroom window was slightly ajar. That's when he heard her. "Oh yes, baby. Faster. You're the best." The words hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. He froze, the flowers slipping from his hand and landing in the dirt. His brain scrambled to process what he'd just heard, but his body refused to move. "Camila," he whispered to himself, disbelief thick in his voice. For a moment, Adrian wondered if he was imagining things. Maybe he was misunderstanding the situation. Maybe it was some kind of joke or a prank show or... "No, right there, don't stop." Camila's voice rang out again, louder this time. The truth was undeniable now. His wife of 15 years, the woman he had trusted with every fiber of his being, was in their bed with someone else. Adrian felt his heart pounding in his chest, his breathing shallow and erratic. He didn't storm into the house. He didn't yell or scream. Instead, he stepped back, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to charge inside, to confront them, to demand answers. But something held him back. He turned and walked slowly toward his car, leaning against the hood as he tried to calm the storm brewing inside him. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "What now?" he muttered under his breath. Adrian stayed outside for another few minutes, weighing his options. He thought about his life with Camila, the vacations, the late-night talks, the plans they had made. Every memory felt like a lie now, tainted by what he had just heard. Taking a deep breath, he decided he wouldn't let his emotions control him. Not yet. He needed clarity, a plan. Bursting in on them would only escalate the situation, and Adrian didn't want to give Camila or her lover the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He walked back to the house, this time entering quietly through the front door. The croissant sat forgotten on the counter as he moved toward the staircase. The creaking sounds were louder now, accompanied by Camila's moans and the deep grunts of a man Adrian didn't recognize. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't need to see their faces to know the truth. Camila's laughter carried down the staircase, light and carefree. For a moment, Adrian froze in the foyer, his hand gripping the banister. That laugh used to mean something: comfort, love, safety. Now it was a cruel reminder of her betrayal. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His chest felt tight, but the anger brewing inside him remained eerily subdued. He refused to explode, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. Adrian made his way to the kitchen, his shoes brushing softly against the hardwood floor. Once there, he opened the cabinet, pulled out a glass, and filled it with water from the faucet. The absurdity of the situation struck him. He was standing in his own kitchen, calmly drinking water, while his wife and her lover desecrated everything he thought their marriage stood for just upstairs. He sat at the dining table, the glass of water in front of him, staring blankly at the surface. Upstairs, the sounds continued. Camila's voice floated down intermittently, soft murmurs turning into stifled giggles. A low male voice responded, too indistinct to make out, but the tone was enough. Adrian felt his jaw clench involuntarily, his grip on the glass tightening. He thought about what he could do. Confront them? burst into the room, shouting and demanding answers. But what would that accomplish? He already knew the truth. He didn't need excuses or apologies. He didn't need Camila to cry and tell him it was a mistake, because mistakes didn't last long enough to have conversations. Adrian finished his water, placed the glass neatly in the sink, and wiped his hands on a dish towel. He took another deep breath, steeling himself. He would handle this his way. He drove back to the office, cause he need time to think, and came home in evening. Adrian climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately skipping the step that creaked. When he reached the top, the bedroom door was slightly ajar. He didn't need to look inside. The sounds told him enough, and he had no desire to see what was happening. Instead, he turned and walked down the hallway to the guest bedroom. Sliding open the closet, he pulled out an old suitcase he hadn't used in years. The zipper stuck at first, and he tugged it loose, shaking his head at the irony of struggling with something so mundane in the middle of his collapsing life. He set the suitcase on the bed and began packing. His movements were calm and methodical. Shirts folded neatly, pants rolled to save space. He picked up the cologne Camila had bought him for their anniversary last year and tossed it in without a second thought. He didn't need to take everything, just the essentials. He would come back for the rest later, after the divorce. Halfway through packing, Adrian heard the bedroom door open behind him. "Adrian?" Camila's voice was sharp, tinged with confusion and panic. Adrian didn't turn around. He grabbed a pair of socks from the drawer and placed them in the suitcase, his back to her. "What the heck are you doing?" she demanded, stepping into the room. Her robe was hastily tied, barely covering her, and her face was flushed. Still, Adrian didn't respond. He reached for another shirt, folding it neatly before adding it to the suitcase. Camila's tone changed, her voice trembling now. "Adrian, why are you packing? What's going on?" Adrian finally turned to face them, his eyes locking onto Camila's. "What am I doing?" He repeated, his voice calm but firm. "I got home this morning and saw that big dark delivery guy passionately doing you. Judging by how you were shouting, 'Oh yes, baby, you're the best. Faster.' I figured I shouldn't get in the way of your special delivery." Camila's face went pale. She staggered back a step, clutching the door frame, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Adrian, no, wait. It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice cracking. Adrian chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Not what it looks like?" He stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Camila, I heard you. I heard every disgusting word. So don't stand there and insult me with, 'It's not what it looks like.'" Camila reached out toward him, tears streaming down her face. "Adrian, please. I'm sorry. I can explain." Adrian raised a hand, stopping her. "I don't want your explanations. I don't want your excuses. What you did doesn't need an explanation. It's already clear as day." "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake. I don't know what I was thinking. Adrian slammed the suitcase shut, the sound making her flinch. "It wasn't a mistake, Camila. A mistake is spilling coffee on your shirt. A mistake is forgetting an appointment. What you did was a choice." He grabbed the suitcase and walked toward the door. "Wait!" Camila cried, dropping to her knees. "Please don't leave me. I'll do anything you want. Just don't go." Adrian stopped in the doorway, his back to her. "The divorce papers are on the kitchen counter," he said flatly. "All I need is your signature. No need to argue. No need to discuss it." He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at her over his shoulder. "You made your choice, Camila. Now live with it." Then he walked out, leaving her sobbing on the floor. As he descended the stairs, Adrian felt an odd sense of clarity. The life he had known was gone, but so was the weight of deception. For the first time in years, he felt free. Adrian's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he made his way back to the guest bedroom, Camila trailing behind him like a shadow. Her sobs filled the house, each one punctuated by desperate pleas that Adrian ignored. "Adrian, please," she cried, her voice cracking. "Don't leave like this. Don't throw everything away." He opened the closet and grabbed another bag, tossing it onto the bed without a word. The zipper whined as he yanked it open, methodically gathering more of his belongings. Camila's presence didn't faze him. Her sobs grew louder. "We've been through so much together. Please, don't let one stupid mistake ruin everything. Adrian let out a bitter laugh as he folded a pair of jeans and tossed them into the bag. One mistake, he said, his tone sharp. He finally turned to look at her, his expression cold and detached. This wasn't a mistake, Camila. It was a choice. You didn't trip and fall into bed with him. You made a decision, and now you get to live with the consequences. Camila clutched her robe tighter, her lips trembling. You don't understand. I was lonely. You're always working, always gone. I felt neglected. And he was just there? Adrian froze for a moment, his hands gripping the shirt he was about to pack. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. Neglected? He repeated, his voice low and dangerous. You felt neglected? Do you have any idea why I've been working so much? Do you? Camila hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I've been working my ass off to give us the life we wanted. To pay off the mortgage. To save for vacations. For our future. Adrian continued, his voice rising. And while I was out there, killing myself to make sure you had everything you ever wanted, you were here bringing another man into our bed. Tears streamed down Camila's face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I messed up, but it didn't mean anything. You didn't mean anything. You're the one I love. Adrian. Adrian snorted, shaking his head. Love? He threw the shirt into the bag with a scoff. If this is your idea of love, then I want nothing to do with it. Camila stepped closer to Adrian, reaching out to grab his arm. Her nails dug into his skin as she sobbed harder. Please, Adrian, don't leave me. I'll do anything. Anything you want. Adrian pulled his arm free and stepped back, glaring at her. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice rising for the first time. This isn't something you can fix. You destroyed us, Camila. You killed everything we had. And now you want me to pretend it never happened? I'm begging you, she cried, falling to her knees. She clutched at his leg, tears streaming down her face. Don't leave me. I can't do this without you. I'll change, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Adrian looked down at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, silence hung in the air. You should have thought about that before, he said finally, his voice cold and detached. He stepped away, forcing her to let go of his leg. Camila sobbed harder, her body shaking. Adrian, please. You're my everything. I was stupid, I was selfish, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Just give me one more chance. Adrian zipped up the second bag and placed it on the floor. He leaned against the dresser, crossing his arms as he stared at her. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked quietly. Do you have any idea what it feels like to come home and find the person you love most in the world betraying you in the worst possible way? I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know I hurt you, but it was a moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything. Adrian clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. It meant something to me, he said through gritted teeth. It meant everything to me, but clearly, it didn't mean the same to you. Camila crawled toward him, grabbing his hands. Please, Adrian, don't throw away everything we've built together. We can get through this. We can go to counseling, therapy, anything you want. Just don't leave me. Adrian yanked his hands away, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? He said, his voice rising. I'm not the one throwing anything away. You did that. You made that choice the second you decided he was worth more than your marriage. Camila buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. I love you, she whispered. I love you so much. I can't lose you. Adrian grabbed the divorce papers from the kitchen counter and dropped them in front of her. Sign these, he said flatly. That's all I need from you now. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with desperation. No, she said, shaking her head. I won't sign them. I won't give up on us. Adrian laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. You already gave up on us, Camila. You gave up the moment you let him into our bed. The room fell silent except for Camila's soft sobs. Adrian picked up his bags and walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at her one last time. You made your choice, Camila, he said quietly. Now live with it. With that, he walked out, leaving her crumpled on the floor, her sobs echoing through the house. As Adrian descended the stairs, he felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a sense of liberation. He had loved Camila deeply, but the woman he thought she was no longer existed. By the time he reached the front door, he realized something else. This wasn't the end for him. It was the beginning of something new, something better. Adrian didn't just pack his things and walk out of Camila's life. That would have been too easy, for her at least. Betrayal of this magnitude deserved consequences, and Adrian was determined to ensure she felt the full weight of what she had done. He wasn't acting out of spite, nor did he consider it vengeance born of anger. This was about justice, about making sure Camila and her lover understood that actions had repercussions. The day after he left the house, Adrian sat in a quiet cafe with his lawyer, a steely-eyed professional named Rebecca Carter. Her reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded her, and Adrian knew she was exactly who he needed. "So, you want to proceed with a divorce," Rebecca said, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. "Clean break?" Or she raised an eyebrow, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "No," Adrian said, his voice firm. "Not clean. She doesn't get to walk away from this without consequences. I want the house, the car, the savings, everything I've worked for. She doesn't get to keep the life she betrayed me for." Rebecca nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll file for fault-based divorce, adultery as the grounds. Since you have proof, that's a slam dunk." Adrian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Proof isn't the issue. I want to make sure she can't manipulate her way out of this. Can we freeze the joint accounts immediately?" Rebecca smirked. "Already done. As of this morning, she can't touch a cent." After leaving the cafe, Adrian drove to a secure storage unit he had rented weeks ago. Camila's affair hadn't been a sudden revelation. He'd suspected something was off for months. Her late-night yoga classes, the sudden increase in her phone's lock screen notifications, the way she avoided his touch, it all added up. Acting on a gut feeling, Adrian had installed discreet cameras in the house, capturing every corner of the bedroom and living room. He had hoped he was wrong, that his paranoia was unfounded. But the footage he had reviewed the day before told a different story, a painful, undeniable truth. Now, that footage was his weapon. Adrian transferred the incriminating videos onto several USB drives, each labeled and organized by date. As he did, he recalled the humiliation of watching his wife with another man in their bed, laughing, touching, and sharing moments that were supposed to belong to him. The pain was still fresh, but it fueled his resolve. The first salvo in his plan was Camila's reputation. Adrian created a new, anonymous email address and drafted a simple message. Subject: "Thought you should know." Attached were clips of the affair, carefully selected to leave no doubt about what was happening. He sent the email to Camila's parents, her siblings, and several of her close friends. He paused before hitting send on the email to her workplace, staring at the screen. She made her choice, he muttered under his breath, and with a single click, the email was on its way. The fallout began within hours. Adrian was sitting in his temporary apartment when his phone buzzed. It was a text from a mutual friend. "Adrian, what the hell is going on? Camila's parents just called me. They're furious." He didn't reply. Instead, he scrolled through social media, watching as Camila's carefully curated image of a perfect wife crumbled. Her Facebook page, once filled with smiling vacation photos and inspirational quotes about love, became a war zone of angry comments and shocked messages. By the next day, Camila called him. Adrian stared at the screen as her name flashed, his thumb hovering over the decline button. But he didn't ignore it. He wanted to hear her reaction. "What do you want, Camila?" he said, his tone cold. "Adrian," she began, her voice trembling. "Please, can we talk? I know you're angry, but what you're doing, it's destroying me." "That's the point," he said bluntly. "Please," she begged. "My parents won't even talk to me. My friends, everyone's turned against me. And my boss," she broke off, choking on a sob. "What about your boss?" Adrian asked, his voice devoid of sympathy. "I lost my job, Adrian," she cried. "They said the scandal was too much. I don't have anything left." Adrian paused, letting her words hang in the air. Then he said, "Maybe you should have thought about that before you brought him into our bed." But he didn't let her finish. You destroyed our marriage, Camila. You don't get to play the victim now." He hung up, ignoring the string of frantic texts that followed. The next part of Adrian's plan focused on her lover. Using the man's name, which Camila had screamed repeatedly during their trysts, Adrian had done some digging. It turned out the guy wasn't just some random fling. He had a long history of messy relationships and a penchant for dating married women. Adrian found the man's social media accounts, noting his frequent posts bragging about his conquests and flexing at the gym. It wasn't hard to track down the guy's workplace either. A quick email with the subject line, "Do you know what your employee does on company time?" attached with a few explicit clips, ensured that Camila's lover would face consequences as well. Over the next week, Camila's life unraveled completely. Her parents disowned her, publicly denouncing her actions to anyone who would listen. Her friends, unwilling to associate with the scandal, cut ties. She was forced to move out of the house Adrian now legally owned, taking only what she could carry. As for her lover, he disappeared the moment the backlash began, blocked her number, deleted their texts, and vanished from her life, leaving her to face the storm alone. One evening, Adrian received an unexpected visitor at his new apartment. He opened the door to find Camila standing there, her face pale and gaunt. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, can we talk?" Adrian stepped aside, allowing her in. She sank onto the couch, clutching a tissue in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "For everything. I don't know what I was thinking. I ruined everything. And now, I have nothing." Adrian leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What do you expect me to say, Camila? That I forgive you? That we can go back to the way things were?" She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'll do anything. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Please, Adrian." He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You already made your choice, Camila, and I've made mine. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about moving on. You should do the same." "Adrian, please," she sobbed, falling to her knees. "I love you. I'll change. You'll what?" Adrian interrupted, his voice sharp. "Undo the past? Erase the betrayal? You can't. And honestly, I don't want you to try." Camila sobbed harder, but Adrian didn't waver. He had spent too long in the shadow of her betrayal. Now it was time for him to step into the light. "Goodbye, Camila," he said, opening the door. She hesitated, looking at him one last time, then walked out, her shoulders slumped in defeat. As the door closed behind her, Adrian felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, the weight of betrayal lifted. He didn't just survive her actions, he rose above them, stronger than before. The first few weeks after Camila's departure were suffocating. Adrian had expected a wave of relief, but instead, there was silence, a heavy, echoing void in the house he once called home. He found himself wandering from room to room, his hands trailing along the walls as memories flooded back. Camila laughing as they painted the kitchen, their first argument in the living room, late-night conversations under the dim glow of their bedside lamp. But those memories were tainted now. He shook them off like dust, forcing himself to focus on the present. He had to rebuild. Adrian poured himself into his work at the tech startup he co-owned with a friend. Long hours and late nights kept his mind occupied, but even then, he found it hard to escape the whispers of betrayal. Every moment of downtime threatened to pull him back into the same mental loop. Why wasn't I enough? To break the cycle, he started running. At first, it was just a jog around the block, a desperate attempt to exhaust his body so his mind wouldn't wander. But soon it became routine. He ran every morning, his sneakers pounding against the pavement as his lungs burned and his muscles screamed. Each step felt like a small victory, a reminder that he was still standing, still moving forward. One evening, after an exhausting day at work and a grueling 5-mile run, Adrian stood in front of the mirror. He hardly recognized the man staring back at him. The extra pounds he'd carried for years were gone. His shoulders were broader, his posture straighter. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. It was during one of these runs at a nearby park that he met Sophie. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book and sipping coffee from a travel mug. Her auburn hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her face was serene, almost wistful. Adrian wouldn't have stopped if it weren't for the dog. A scruffy golden retriever darted into his path, nearly tripping him. "Max!" Sophie called, setting her book down. "I'm so sorry." He gets too excited when he sees runners. Adrian bent down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "No harm done. He's a friendly one." Sophie smiled, a little sheepishly. "Too friendly sometimes. I think he believes the whole world exists to pet him." Adrian chuckled. "Well, it's working. He's already charmed me." They chatted for a few minutes about Max, the park, and the unpredictability of autumn weather. Adrian found himself lingering longer than he'd intended, drawn to Sophie's easy demeanor. She had a warmth about her, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate without effort. Their paths crossed again a week later at a coffee shop near the park. Sophie was sitting in the corner, typing on her laptop. Adrian hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, holding up his coffee cup. She looked up, surprised but pleased. "Well, if it isn't Max's new best friend." They talked for over an hour, sharing stories about their work, their hobbies, and their lives. Sophie worked as a freelance editor, juggling multiple projects and deadlines. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had been through a difficult breakup the year before. Adrian didn't press for details, but he caught the flicker of pain in her eyes. Their friendship grew naturally. They started meeting at the park for walks with Max, who had officially adopted Adrian as one of his humans. Gradually, their conversations became deeper, more personal. Sophie shared how her ex had betrayed her trust, leaving her wary of relationships. Adrian, in turn, opened up about Camila's infidelity and the fallout that followed. "Do you ever feel like it's your fault?" Sophie asked one evening as they sat on a park bench, watching the sunset. "All the time," Adrian admitted. "Even though I know it's not rational. I worked hard, I was faithful. I gave her everything I could, but it still wasn't enough." Sophie nodded. "I get that. My ex made me feel the same way, like I wasn't good enough. But you know what I've realized?" "What's that?" "It's not about us. People who betray others. It's about their flaws, their weaknesses. Not ours." Her words stuck with him, resonating in a way he hadn't expected. Months passed, and their friendship deepened into something more. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping romantic gesture. It was subtle, Sophie resting her head on Adrian's shoulder during a movie, his hand brushing hers as they walked, the way her laughter felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds. One night, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant, Adrian finally admitted what he'd been feeling. "Sophie, I never thought I'd say this again, but you've made me believe in love again." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "I never thought I'd believe in it again either. But you've shown me that love can be kind and patient and real." Meanwhile, Camila's life had spiraled into chaos. The fallout from Adrian's calculated revenge had left her isolated and struggling. Her friends avoided her calls, and her parents had all but disowned her. The man she had betrayed Adrian for had disappeared the moment things got difficult, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. She tried reaching out to Adrian multiple times, texts, emails, even a handwritten letter. Each time, her words were desperate, filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. "I made a mistake. I was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for what I did to you. Please, Adrian, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Just give me one more chance." Adrian read the messages, but never replied. He had moved on, not just from Camila, but from the man he had been during their marriage. One day, Camila showed up at his office unannounced. Adrian's assistant buzzed him, sounding uncertain. "There's a woman here to see you. She says it's urgent." Adrian sighed, already knowing who it was. "Send her in." Camila entered, her once confident demeanor replaced by a hollow, desperate look. She wore no makeup, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. "Adrian," she began, her voice trembling. "I know you don't want to see me, but I had to try." "What do you want, Camila?" he asked, his tone calm but distant. "I want to fix things. I've changed, I swear. I've been going to therapy, and I've been working on myself. I know I don't deserve it, but please, can we try again? Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. For a moment, he felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by a deep sense of clarity. I'm glad you're working on yourself, Camila. Truly. But we're done. That chapter of my life is closed. Tears streamed down her face. But we had 15 years together. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It did, Adrian said, but you threw it away. And now, I found someone who values me the way I deserve to be valued. Camila's sobs filled the room, but Adrian remained firm. He wasn't angry anymore, just resolute. Later that evening, Adrian met Sophie for dinner. She noticed the lingering tension in his posture. Everything okay? She asked gently. Camila came to my office today, he admitted. Sophie's brow furrowed. What did she want? To get back together. Sophie hesitated. And what did you say? Adrian reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I told her the truth, that I've moved on, and that I'm with someone who reminds me every day what love is supposed to feel like. Sophie smiled, her fingers tightening around his. For the first time in a long time, Adrian felt whole again. It had been 5 years since Adrian last saw Camila. His life with Sophie was everything he had once thought impossible. Their days were filled with laughter, shared dreams, and the kind of partnership he had always imagined a marriage could be. But fate has a way of revisiting old wounds, and that day, as they strolled through the farmer's market hand in hand, an unexpected shadow fell over Adrian's path. Sophie was inspecting a stand of fresh peaches when Adrian noticed her, a gaunt figure hovering near the bread stand, shoulders hunched, hair limp. It took him a moment to recognize her, but when Camila turned, their eyes met, and time seemed to slow. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and rimmed with dark circles. The confident, polished woman he had once known was gone. In her place stood someone beaten down by life, her clothes mismatched and slightly frayed, her frame thin and weary. She hesitated, then took a tentative step toward him. Adrian, she said softly, almost a whisper. Sophie glanced up, following Adrian's gaze. Do you know her? Yes, Adrian replied evenly. It's Camila. Sophie's expression didn't change. She simply gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. I'll give you a moment, she said kindly, stepping aside but staying within earshot. Adrian turned back to Camila, who now stood a few feet away, clutching her purse strap with trembling hands. What do you want, Camila? Her voice cracked as she spoke. Adrian, I didn't expect to see you here. She looked down, avoiding his steady gaze. I've wanted to talk to you for a long time. Adrian crossed his arms, his posture calm but firm. Talk about what? We said everything that needed to be said years ago. Camila's eyes filled with tears, and she took another step closer. Please, Adrian, just listen. I need to tell you, I'm sorry. For everything. For betraying you. For hurting you the way I did. Her voice faltered, and she wiped at her eyes. I was selfish, blind, and so stupid. I ruined the best thing I ever had, and I've been paying for it every day since. Adrian watched her for a moment, his face unreadable. The years had softened the anger he once felt, but they had also given him clarity. Camila, he said, his tone even, I forgave you a long time ago. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying that anger wasn't worth it. Her eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. Does that mean can we talk? Maybe start over? Adrian shook his head, his voice firm but not unkind. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean opening the door you slammed shut. I've moved on, Camila. I've built a life, a good life, with someone who respects and values me. I hope you've taken this time to reflect and grow, but whatever we had is gone. Camila's face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. I've tried, Adrian. I really have. But my life, it's a mess. After you left, everything fell apart. I lost my job, my friends, my family's respect. I don't know how to fix it. Adrian looked at her, his expression a mix of pity and detachment. You don't fix it by clinging to the past. You made your choices, Camila, and now you have to live with them. Just like I had to live with the pain you caused. But I found a way to move forward. You need to do the same. Camilla's tears flowed freely now, and she reached out as if to touch his arm, but he stepped back. "Please," she whispered. "I don't know how to do this alone." Adrian's voice softened, but his resolve remained unshaken. "You're stronger than you think. Use that strength to rebuild. But don't look to me to save you. That's not my role anymore." At that moment, Sophie returned, holding a bag of fresh peaches. She slipped her arm through Adrian's and smiled politely at Camilla. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Adrian nodded. "Yes, we're done here." He looked at Camilla one last time, his expression calm but resolute. "I hope you find peace, Camilla. Goodbye." As he and Sophie walked away, Camilla stood frozen, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a physical burden. Adrian didn't look back, and neither did Sophie. Later that evening, as Adrian and Sophie sat on their back porch, sipping wine and watching the sunset, Sophie finally spoke. "She looked lost," Sophie said, her tone thoughtful. Adrian nodded. "She is, but that's not my responsibility anymore." Sophie reached for his hand. "You're a good man, Adrian. A lot of people would have let that bitterness consume them, but you didn't. You turned it into something better." He squeezed her hand, a small smile playing on his lips. "I had help," he said, looking at her. Sophie grinned. "You've done most of the work, but I'm glad I could be part of it." As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Adrian felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. Camilla was a part of his past, a chapter that had taught him hard but valuable lessons. And now, as he sat beside the woman who had shown him what true love and partnership could be, he knew he had finally turned the page. There was no anger, no lingering pain, just peace. And that was all he needed. The chapel was small but filled with light, the afternoon sun streaming through stained glass windows, casting vibrant hues across the room. Adrian adjusted his tie as he stood at the altar, his heart beating steadily. This wasn't nervousness, it was something different, something peaceful. Sophie walked down the aisle, her smile radiant. There was no pomp or spectacle, just sincerity in every step, every look they exchanged. This wedding was a quiet celebration, shared with only the people who mattered: his brother Mark, Sophie's best friend Anna, and a handful of close family and friends. When Sophie reached him, she whispered, "You ready?" Adrian smiled. "I've been ready for a long time." The ceremony was simple. Their vows reflected who they were, not just promises of love, but commitments of respect, partnership, and honesty. As Adrian slid the ring onto Sophie's finger, he felt the weight of his past finally lift. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant said warmly. "You may kiss the bride." Adrian leaned in. Their kiss met with gentle applause from the small crowd. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just the start of a new chapter. It was the beginning of an entirely new story. The reception was held in Sophie's parents' backyard, a quaint garden surrounded by blooming flowers. Laughter filled the air as guests shared stories and clinked glasses. Adrian sat at a table, watching Sophie talk animatedly with her parents. She had a way of drawing people in, her kindness and warmth undeniable. Mark plopped down beside Adrian, handing him a glass of champagne. "Well, you finally did it. You found someone who doesn't just tolerate your quirks, but actually loves you for them." Adrian laughed. "Took me long enough, huh?" Mark nodded, his tone turning more serious. "I gotta say, man, after everything you went through, it's good to see you like this. Happy. You deserve it." Adrian looked out at the crowd, taking in the joy around him. "I didn't think I'd get here, you know. After Camilla, I thought maybe I wasn't built for this kind of life." Mark shook his head. "Camilla didn't break you. She just showed you what you didn't want. And now, you've got what you do want: a real partner. Someone who's got your back." Adrian clinked his glass against Mark's. "To new beginnings." To Sophie, Mark added with a grin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the guests began to leave. Sophie found Adrian sitting on a wooden swing at the edge of the yard, a quiet spot away from the lingering party noise. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, slipping her arm around his. "Always," he replied, pulling her close. They swayed gently, the creak of the swing blending with the soft chirping of crickets. "Do you ever think about her?" Sophie asked after a moment. Adrian didn't need to ask who she meant. Not often. And when I do, it's not with anger anymore. It's like remembering a book I read a long time ago. It had some important lessons, but I'm glad it's finished. Sophie nodded. I hope she's found her way, somehow, even if it's far from here. Adrian shrugged. Maybe, but that's not my story to worry about anymore. He looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with gratitude. You're my story now. Sophie smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. And you're mine. Over the next few years, Adrian's life flourished. He and Sophie bought a small home on the edge of town with a garden that Sophie loved to tend. Adrian's career continued to grow, but he made sure never to let it overshadow the life they were building together. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Sophie reading and Adrian tinkering with a model airplane, she looked up suddenly. Do you ever think about how far you've come? She asked. Adrian put the plane down and thought for a moment. All the time. It's like I had to go through the worst to appreciate the best. If you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be here, with you, living this life, I wouldn't have believed it. She smiled. Well, believe it. You earned it. As for Camila, her life had taken a very different path. The fallout from her affair had left her isolated, struggling to rebuild. She bounced between jobs, her reputation tarnished by the scandal Adrian had exposed. Friends she once trusted distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the mess she had created. Years later, Camila sat in a small apartment, scrolling through social media. She stumbled upon a photo of Adrian and Sophie, smiling in front of their home, a dog playfully jumping at their feet. Her chest tightened as she stared at the image. Adrian looked happy, truly happy. It was a happiness she had never been able to give him, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise. Camila closed the app and set her phone aside. For years, she had clung to the hope that Adrian might give her another chance, that they could somehow mend what had been broken. But seeing him now, it was clear he had moved on, and she was nothing more than a distant memory. She sighed, looking around her empty apartment. Regret gnawed at her, but she knew it was her burden to bear. Adrian had rebuilt his life, and it was time she found a way to rebuild hers. Back in Adrian and Sophie's home, a new chapter was beginning. Sophie had just told Adrian she was pregnant, and the news filled him with a joy he hadn't known was possible. As they sat together on the couch, Sophie resting her head on his shoulder, Adrian felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. I never thought I'd have this, he said quietly. Sophie looked up at him. Have what? A second chance? At life? At love? She smiled, her hand resting on her growing belly. Sometimes, the best things come after the hardest lessons. Adrian kissed her forehead, holding her close. Here's to the best things. And with that, Adrian closed the door on the past for good, fully embracing the future he had built, a future filled with love, trust, and the promise of new beginnings.